On behalf of the organizers and co-sponsors of today's event, I warmly welcome all of you. My name is Anita Thomas, Chair of the NGO Committee on Financing for Development, one of the co-sponsors of today's session. Thank you for joining us today for our 2025 High-Level Political Forum side event entitled Beyond Default, the Liberating Power of Debt Reform. Before we start, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Please keep yourself muted throughout the event. Feel free to introduce yourself and ask questions using the chat function. We have Spanish and English interpretation available. To enable it, click the interpretation button on your Zoom toolbar and select your preferred language. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which we are gathering. Even as we gather virtually, I invite you all to introduce yourself in the chat and to name where you are joining from and to include the indigenous territory if you know it. Let us take a moment to acknowledge and honor the power of the sun, wind, and the rain, that nurtures life on earth, the spirits of the fields, the forests and mountains, and oceans and rivers, and all that lives within. The wisdom of our ancestors, the indigenous peoples, and the original inhabitants of the land we are on. In particular, we wish to acknowledge the land upon which the United Nations headquarters stands, politically designated as New York City, the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. The Lenape are a diasporic people that remain closely connected with this land and are its rightful stewards. We also recognize that New York City has one of the largest urban Native American indigenous populations in the United States. Let us affirm our desire for right relations with all indigenous peoples built on respect and reciprocity. Let us commit to redress the harms of colonization. With that, I would like to share brief opening remarks in light of today's topic. Unsustainable debt does more than strain public budgets. It hampers essential services, prevents investment in people and the planet, and traps generations in poverty. At the same time, we must acknowledge the moral and ecological debt owed by wealthier nations, built over centuries of extractivism, climate destruction, and financial injustice. As we focus on SDG Target 17.4, supporting developing countries to achieve long-term debt sustainability through coordinated financing, relief, and restructuring, we must recognize that this is not just a technical issue, but a deeply human and urgent one. Today's event is part of the Global Jubilee Year campaign, which calls for an economy rooted in justice, solidarity, and sustainability, where debt serves human dignity, not market speculation. A global coalition of faith groups, labor unions, and civil society organizations has launched the Turn Debt into Hope campaign, calling for the cancellation and remedying of unjust and unsustainable debt, reforms to international financial architecture, and a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. Just 2 weeks ago, the international community adopted the Sevilla outcome at the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. While not perfect, it marks a meaningful step towards reshaping global finance in support of the SDGs. The Sevilla outcome confronts a harsh reality. Over 3.3 billion people live in countries where debt payments exceed spending on health and education. Many face interest rates 4 to 12 times higher than those of wealthy nations. This is worsened by the digital divide and automation, which threatens jobs, especially among women and youth in informal economies. These are systemic injustices driven by unfair debt rules, regressive taxation, unrepresentative governance, and misaligned aid flows. The outcome document sets out 3 core commitments: mobilizing more and better investments across all sectors, resetting debt practices for transparency and fair restructuring, amplifying the voice of developing countries in global financial decision-making. To support this, the Sevilla Platform for Action includes over 130 initiatives, such as Debt Pause Alliance, a global debt registry, state contingent debt clauses, and credit rating reforms aligned with sustainability. Sovereign debt is not just an economic issue, it is a matter of social justice, climate justice, and gender justice. We stand at the threshold of a commitment to action. Civil society plays a vital role in this matter to ensure a just, resilient, and inclusive global financial system. Through today's dialogue, we hope you gain the tools and resolve to drive transformative change. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sue Wilson, Sister of St. Joseph and Executive Director of the Office for Systemic Justice. Her full bio is on the screen. Welcome, Sue. Over to you.
Thank you, Anita. And I appreciate the links you just made there between financial debt, the sustainable development goals, and the well-being of people and the planet. You also made it clear that there are many different dimensions to the issue of debt reform. Before we get to our panelists, I'd like to highlight five different ways of looking at the issue so that we can see how each dimension raises different questions for us to explore. For example, debt reform can be approached in terms of structural and systemic issues. This might lead us to ask, who benefits more from the structures, lenders or borrowers? What's the impact of these structures on debt-distressed countries? What's their impact on development? And how can changes to structures be part of the solution? Or we can examine debt reform in terms of power, which might prompt us to ask, who's at the table when decisions are made about how to deal with unsustainable debts? We can look through the lens of agency and responsibility, asking, in what ways do both lenders and borrowers contribute to unsustainable debt, and how do they do so? What other factors outside of anyone's control need to be considered and responded to? And we can look at the impacts of sustainable debts, asking, what happens to the Sustainable Development Goals when countries are pressured to prioritize the payment of debt over making investments in health, education, industrial strategy, infrastructure, and climate adaptation? And finally, Pope Francis approached the issue of debt reform through the lens of scriptural justice. Rooted in the biblical tradition of Jubilee, he invited people to deepen their faith by taking actions that have the potential to transform both ourselves and the world. So I'd like to spend a little more time with this lens because it touches the motivation behind this webinar. When Pope Francis called for debt cancellation for low-income countries and for reforms to the international financial system, he insisted that it wasn't a question of generosity, but a matter of justice. The lens of justice raises the question of who owes whom. And Pope Francis urged us to explore this question when he juxtaposed unsustainable financial debts and ecological debt. Now, just quickly, ecological debt's a term that refers to that long-term environmental harm and overuse of ecological systems caused by intensive resource extraction in the global south in order to meet consumer demands in the global north. And climate debt is one aspect of ecological debt. So with that question of who owes whom, Pope Francis invited us into a space of transformation. And earlier this month, the bishops of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean laid out some of the features of this transformation in a statement they made ahead of the upcoming COP30 climate conference. The bishops are insisting that wealthy countries, as the main historical actors responsible for extracting natural resources and emitting greenhouse gases, need to assume their social and ecological debt and commit to climate finance that is fair, accessible, and does not generate more debt. The bishops are also calling for governments to transform the economic system towards a restorative model that prioritizes people's well-being and ensures conditions for sustainable life on the planet. And they're calling for an historic coalition from both the global south and the north to address the issue of debt, to strengthen communities, and to ensure conditions for life on the planet to thrive. Now, there's much more in the statement, but for now, I just want to emphasize how the bishops have picked up the spirit and the challenge of Pope Francis's call to Jubilee. And to note that we too are being challenged to step into this space of transformation through our choices and actions. So in that spirit, we turn to our panelists today. The speakers have been asked to limit themselves to 7 to 10 minutes of input. But we will have time for questions if there are areas that you want to delve into more deeply. Please put your questions in the chat, and Sarah will gather them up for us. I will briefly introduce each speaker just before it's their turn to speak, and you will be able to view a fuller description of their background on the slide. So our first speaker today is Sister Petrona Ludovina Hernandez, and she is bringing us insights into debt reform that emerged from her life and her experiences in Honduras. Ludovina is a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Holy Rosary. She is active in a number of organizations and commissions. I'll highlight just two: the National Commission for Integral Ecology of the Conference of Religious Women of Honduras, and the National Commission for Integral Ecology of the Mesoamerican Ecclesial Network of Integral Ecology. So Ludovina, welcome, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Honduras is a country full of richnesses, natural richnesses. And how is the external debt affecting our country? Nowadays, our foreign debt in Honduras is approximately almost $10 billion. The debt for nature swap is an innovative financial mechanism that allows developing countries to reduce their foreign debt in exchange for investments in environmental conservation. In this type of transaction, a portion of the debt is forgiven in exchange for the country's investment in conservation measures for its natural resources and biodiversity. How does the foreign debt affect the environmental crisis? Supposedly, it doesn't, but the reality is different because there are 18 departments in Honduras, and out of the 18, 17 are under concession. Honduras, since before the conquest, and not just Honduras, but all of Latin America, has been plundered with all its natural wealth. And here is the big question: why is Honduras one of the poorest countries in the world while being so rich in natural resources? And the answer is because there have been no rulers with a spirit of common good and clean and fair consciousness. The riches have been distributed among those who have a lot and who disregard the poorest. When our human rights and environmental defenders oppose the destruction of life, defending and protecting all our natural resources, our land, our water, and all our biodiversity, the one that exists in our territories, they are threatened, prosecuted, criminalized, martyred, and they disappear. How does foreign debt affect Honduras in education? The reality of education in Honduras is complex and faces multiple challenges, considering that significant efforts have been made to improve the quality and access to education, starting from the relationship between the reality of Honduran households and education. Clearly, it is deeply marked by socioeconomical, cultural, and structural factors that directly affect access, quality, and permanence of students in the education system. Parents are forced to give a contribution for the cleaner, the watch person, for repairs, for painting, etc., in the schools, among other factors. And we need to add to that violence, unemployment, etc. And these are real aspects that all the inhabitants of Honduras are facing on a daily basis. On the other hand, it is evident that education is also immersed in a dynamic and changing environment where different forces exert a significant impact on its development and evolution, which becomes a major challenge for rural areas of the country, since in these areas access to education is more limited due to the lack of schools or universities, inadequate infrastructure, and shortage of qualified teachers, because they send homework over the internet and children do not have cell phones and cannot do their homework. And that's why they desert school. In urban areas, on the other hand, it could be considered that there is a greater possibility for education. But children and young adults, they face other problems such as overcrowded schools and educational lack of educational quality. Education in Honduras requires comprehensive attention, an attention that addresses not only access but also the equality, equity, sustainability of the education system. It is incomprehensible that children can leave the sixth grade without knowing how to read and write, and parents do not understand it. So they themselves decide to take them out and not to let them continue without knowing anything. We need strong public policies, investment in infrastructure, teacher training programs, and social programs to reduce structural barriers and ensure inclusive and quality education for all Hondurans. 3 years later, the educational remodelation or refoundation is still pending in Honduras. Although there is free tuition and an incomplete school lunch, because the only thing they give is oil, corn, flour, and beans at the beginning of the school year, it can be given. It can be given, but some mothers change the menu, and everybody do the best they can, but they are not really offer a breakfast or lunch. There are structural failures that affect the quality of education in Honduras. After 3 years of government, the advancement in education is still a failure. The president of Honduras, who became president in 2022, has still to do a lot for education. It is one of the biggest challenges of her mandate. We have over 1 million children that have not access to education, and the pandemic in 2019 aggravated the problem. At the moment, in Honduras, uh, at the moment, the number of children registered at school in Honduras is 1,787,000 children, which is not enough. And they are usually registered in primary schools, not even secondary school. Of course, there have been advancements, but the education system is in crisis in general. There is a lack of resources, and our Honduran president promised to improve the quality of education and to create a school environment that would be equal for everybody. But she is 7 months away of finishing her mandate, and the programs that she intended to put in place have failed. At the end of 2024, 1,900,000 children are outside the education system. And during the mandate of this president, only 7,000 children had new access to education. The foreign debt in Honduras is affects around 6,400,000 people because they are poor. They are poor. External debt or foreign debt in Honduras affects poverty in several ways. The financing system is based on deepening external debt and has led to trends such as declining wages, concentration of profits, and instrumentalization for electoral political purposes. Extreme poverty in Honduras continues to increase in both rural and urban areas. The Central Bank of Honduras has revealed that the country's public external debt has experienced a significant increase during the first months of 2023. Despite efforts made to pay off commitments inherited from previous administrations, Honduras continues to face a worrisome external debt burden. According to economist Ismael Cepeda of the Honduran Social Forum on Foreign Debt and Development, FOSDE, public debt has increased over the last decade as a necessity for the state. External debt in Honduras affects health. It affects negatively public health because it reduces investment in essential services, such as healthcare and disease prevention. This can lead to a deterioration of health infrastructure, lack of medicines and drugs and personnel, and a limited access to care for the population, especially for those who are in vulnerable situations. To meet the payments, governments may be forced to cut public spending in areas such as health, education, and social programs, which directly affects the quality of life of the population. How can foreign debt affect health of the Honduran people? Foreign debt in Honduras can negatively affect public health by reducing investment in essential services such as medical care and disease prevention. There is a lack of personnel, lack of medicines, and limited access to care for the population.
La deuda puede obligar a implementar medidas como copagos o
This foreign debt might force certain measures like the reduced investment, deteriorated health infrastructure, shortage of medicines and personnel. People have to pay an extra fee to have access to medical services, and the early detection of certain disease can be affected. That is, foreign debt can affect seriously for the health services in Honduras, and it reduces basic services. There is a lack of resources and a lack of medicaments and lack of personnel. And the personnel that is hired is not well trained. People with less resources has no access to these services because they cannot have access to a health center because health centers are very far away. Foreign debt.
El gobierno puede priorizar el pago de la deuda sobre la inversión en salud, lo que puede llevar a retrasos en la
Well,
construcción
the government can increase the fees for medical services in order to pay off foreign debt.
Hermana Ludivina, creo que ya estamos sobre tiempo.
Muy bien. Gracias.
I believe we have run out of time.
Okay. Yes, and I regret that there has to be a time limit because the information you're giving is so important. But I do think, you know, we need to leave time for others. So, you know, this is just a time for us
Claro,
to.
sí, está bien, gracias.
So, yeah.
It's okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So, Ludivina, you've demonstrated well, I think, even with the time you had, that when governments prioritize debt payments over investments in healthcare, education, the environmental care, it does undermine efforts to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, and ordinary people pay the price, whether through lack of access to education and healthcare, decent wages, and that the gap between rich and poor is exacerbated. So we'll hold on to those points and move forward to our next speaker. Dr. Martin Guzman has served as Minister of the Economy of the Republic of Argentina from 2019 to July 2022. He is a leading expert in the field of sovereign debt and debt crisis resolution. Currently, Dr. Guzman is the co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, an academic center at Columbia University Business School, which works to deepen dialogue and explore the trade-offs in development policy by bringing the best ideas in development to policymakers. In addition, he is a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences in the Vatican. So welcome, Martin, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to present some of the main findings and conclusions of the Jubilee Report commissioned by Pope Francis. It actually relates directly to the events that Sister Ludivina was presenting earlier related to Honduras and to the reality that many different countries, dozens of countries in the developing world are struggling with today. And I'm glad we have Griff Chelwa today also in the panel, who is also a member of the Jubilee Commission. It's a commission formed by more than 30 experts on debt and development. So let me begin with the facts. Unlike what certain stakeholders have been manifesting over the last few years, we do have a massive debt and development crisis today in the world. Some call the situation a situation of a liquidity challenge. But the reality is that we are seeing that many countries are prioritizing debt payments over development, and they are defaulting on economic development. The data is clear. We have more than 2 billion people today that live in countries that spend more on debt than on education. More than 3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debts than on health. The interest payments in the developing world have doubled over the last decade as a share of the tax revenues. And these countries are receiving financing from the international financial institutions. The flows coming into the countries have been positive. However, that financing, rather than being used for policies for the economic recovery and the development of the countries in crisis, it's being used to repay the holders of the debts that are today in distress. So what we are seeing de facto is a bailout, mostly of the private sector, private holders mostly, financed by the global taxpayers of the world and the citizens of affected countries that at the same time that they repay unsustainable debts, they cut on the critical expenses on education, health, and public infrastructure. The situation is quite dramatic in many of these countries. My continent, Latin America, suffered a massive debt crisis in the 1980s, and it led to 2 lost decades in terms of economic and social development. The social indicators by 20 years after the beginning of the crisis, 20 years after the early 80s, were about the same as at the beginning of the crisis. And in these instances, a pervasive issue is always the global narrative. There are winners and losers, and the gains from inaction, the gains from delaying the resolution of the crisis are just concentrated in a small number of stakeholders, but the losses are widely distributed among billions of people. So when you see a situation with that asymmetry, in which the winners are so concentrated and the gains are so concentrated, it's natural, it's quite of the expected results that the global narrative is dominated by those. And that's what we have seen. And we've been wasting time. I was finance minister of Argentina when the G20, the common framework for debt treatment was created at the G20. And let me tell you what I think about it. It's a framework that it was supposed to be conducive to the resolution of the debt distress that countries were suffering first after the pandemic, or right when the pandemic began, and then after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, when the distress got worse. By then, the narrative was that the main problem was the fact that there were new creditors outside of the Paris Club, official bilateral creditors, that were not contributing enough relief. And that was true by then, but it turns out that the biggest problem was with the private sector. Let me share the numbers. In 2022, there were outflows of these countries, say pay off debts, in the low and lower middle income countries, in the amount of $6 billion to the non-Paris Club bilateral official creditors, but they pay more than $50 billion to the private sector. So you can see the magnitude of the difference. All were part of the problem, but the biggest problem has been with the private sector. And with the common framework, countries continue repaying the debts while they negotiated. So that lack of debt payment suspension for all the countries with all the creditors, including the private creditors, the fact that that did not happen is what led to this waste of time, these bailouts of private creditors financed by the international financial institutions. So the Commission basically develops a set of proposals, both for addressing the crisis right now, the crisis that we're having, but also for preventing that crisis occur so often. Crises happen more often than they should. It's possible to avoid many of these situations. And to begin with, there has to be a change in incentives. So let me turn to the questions that were raised by Sue Wilson in the introduction to this panel. So who benefits from the current structure? Clearly, the losers are the people of the countries that get their hope vanished by the situation they are going through. Who is benefiting today? Mostly those that lend at high interest rates. They lent at 8, 9, 10% interest rates after 2008, after the crisis in the US, and they're still getting repaid in the times of distress. Those are the biggest winners from the current structure. But there are also pervasive problems of what economists call political economy. Debtors many times want to borrow, and they did it, prioritizing the short term. And when they have to give the international fights to achieve a resolution of the debt crisis, they prefer many times not to do it because of the cost, the short-term cost that those fights entail. Who is at the table of negotiation? It should always be, when a debt is unsustainable, the government should have the steering wheel. Otherwise, there is trouble. Otherwise, no one is going to represent the citizens of a country in distress if it's not the government. It's not going to be an advisor, it's not going to be the IMF, it's not going to be the other creditors. It has to be the government. And that's part of what's needed today. But of course, the system has to enable governments to defend the interests of the people. And most times it is very, very difficult and very, very costly for governments to do the right thing. How debtors and lenders contribute to unsustainable debts? It takes two sides to create the problem of unsustainable debt. The problems that we have today are problems that have shared responsibility. Creditors decided to lend at high interest rates with short maturities. Debtors decided to borrow at those rates and with those maturities, and they decided not to implement regulations, capital account regulations that would make the capital flows more stable. That just didn't happen, and now we have this problem. And the consequences for SDGs were very clearly described by Sister Ludivina before for Honduras, but this is a reality that many countries are going through. So basically, countries, rather than making progress, go back in time when it comes to achieving sustainable development goals. Let me conclude by saying that the situation can be changed. There are policies that can lead to resolving the problem today and to preventing the problem in the future. To begin with, there should be a no bailout condition, associated to the financing of the international financial institutions. When they lend, the money has to be used for the purposes and the mission that those institutions are supposed to pursue, not for repaying debts in distress. And the institutions have the toolkit, the policy toolkit to implement this condition. For instance, the IMF could implement more effectively the policy of lending into arrears that describes the conditions under which it can still lend to a country when a country is in a situation of default with creditors, and the lending should be used for economic recovery and for economic development. Then there should be changes in legislation in the jurisdictions where debts are issued, mostly New York State. There are significant flaws in the New York legislation. The New York legislation compensates at very high interest rates the holders of debts in arrears, of debts in default. On top of the return on the debts in default that the contracts state, the holders of those debts get 9% per year extra, because it's what the New York legislation established in 1981 in a very different environment, and that should change. The Senate in the New York State already approved a change, and now their assembly in New York State needs to approve it. That will help matters. And finally, there have to be comprehensive reforms to the system. The system is part of the problem. And I don't have more time to provide more details on that, but I expect to discuss that during that part of the report during the Q&A. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you so much, Martin. That was great. If I'd known you would answer my questions directly, I would have asked more. But I really appreciated the way you spoke about debt and development crisis together as one crisis, to emphasize how intertwined they are. And the way you showed that the structures of the finance system function in a way that benefits the few at the cost of the many. So with that analysis, I think we're well placed to move on. And our third speaker is Ms. Anjali Appadurai. Anjali is the Director of Campaigns at Climate Emergency Unit. She spent her entire career building a strong civil society voice at the UN Climate Convention. Today, Anjali is passionate about making the links between climate change, globalization, colonization, and economic inequality. She previously worked as climate justice lead at Sierra Club, BC, bringing an equity lens to her work. Anjali is also a singer, songwriter, and a music producer. She hopes to weave politics and art together to reflect the times we are living in and to galvanize true collective action. So welcome, Anjali, and please go ahead.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. And it was wonderful to hear my previous fellow speakers. I'm very grateful to be here. So I will jump right in and I will share a few slides. Okay, so just a few slides to share. I just want to introduce myself very quickly. My name is Anjali, and I'm a climate communicator and activist. I have been in the climate justice movement since for the last about 15 years, and I'm rooted on Coast Salish territories in so-called Vancouver, BC in Canada. Sorry, I'm going to stop this share for 1 second so I can get my notes. Uh, okay, I wonder how I can do this. Speaker notes, audience QA. Okay. Well, that is okay. I'm just going to roll through these slides without my notes. I'm so sorry about that. Um, so I just wanted to speak a little bit more to the climate angle because my work deals with climate justice, and I learned from a very early age. I sort of got my start in the climate justice movement through organizing with young people from around the world at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and we had a small youth organization called Earth in Brackets, where we sort of organized young people from around the world to stand in solidarity with developing countries and to stand for principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility um, and development. And so when I returned back to Vancouver and started working in the environmental movement in Canada, I was struck by how sometimes the climate movement has been has sort of not included as many themes of true climate justice as it could. And to me, climate justice is inherently rooted in development and in the addressing of ecological debt. So I wanted to speak a little bit to ecological debt and starting off with this very stark sort of graphic that shows this is from a report by ActionAid International, which sort of shows that climate debt, which, as Sue mentioned earlier, is an aspect or a facet of ecological debt, is so incredibly high that it's more than 100 times the actual foreign debt held by lower middle income countries. And so climate debt is something that has accumulated over time and is the result of many of the same factors that ecological debt has caused. So I'll go into that in a minute. So the other speakers definitely spoke to this, but but ecological debt is an expansive term that is about the myriad costs of ecological damage caused over time. And I would expand this definition to be more than just between countries. I think it's so difficult when we're talking about these sort of global trends that we're talking about countries interacting with each other, yes, but we're also talking about the inequity within countries. We're talking about the wealth accumulation within countries where we have wealth concentrated at the very top, where there are elites who are holding the majority of wealth in many countries in the world. And so it's also unequal that way. It's also the exploitation of or use of ecosystems over time by a country at the expense of the equitable rights to these ecosystems by other countries. when I was a youth activist, we would talk about the rights of future generations. And we had this tagline that was, "How old will you be in 2050?" Which was sort of this illustration of it's a ecological debt is a theft from the most vulnerable people, populations, and ecosystems on Earth, but it's also a theft from future generations and from the future right to a just and sustainable future. As the speakers before me spoke to so beautifully, the root causes of ecological debt are in colonialism and resource extraction. It's hundreds of years of extracting from the earth without a collectivist, holistic view of the costs of those damages. Capitalism and industrialization obviously accelerated that growth, and we live under a global economic paradigm of seemingly endless growth that is based on a fallacy because we live on a finite planet. And ecological debt is also rooted in land theft from indigenous peoples the world over and from the theft of labor as well. And war and militarization is sort of self-explanatory as we see global militaries ramping up, even in today's world. And we know that when it comes to climate, military emissions aren't counted in global emissions, but they are enormous in scale and scope. There are so many robust debt justice movements around the world, and I'll be speaking to a little bit of that work today. So just want to talk about this idea of climate debt. Now that we've talked about the umbrella of ecological debt, climate debt is accumulated through what we would call an unfair accumulation of atmospheric space. If we think about the Earth as if we think about our atmosphere as a finite resource, similar to all the other finite resources we have on Earth, and if we think about every person and every living being as having a right to exist in a certain amount of atmospheric space, to exist with a certain amount of health, clean water, air to breathe, then the accumulation of that atmospheric space has built into a climate debt. Also, we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, when the convention, which is the most ratified convention of all the UN treaties. Almost every country in the world is a part of the UNFCCC. And under that convention, there are principles of equity and of burden sharing that obligate, especially developed countries, especially the world's richest countries, to contribute to the problem, to the scale and to the proportion of their to contribute to the solution to the proportion of their contribution to the problem. And so their failure to do so has accumulated more climate debt. And when we think about what the actual needs are to adapt to the climate crisis, to mitigate the climate crisis, especially in the global south, the need is in the trillions. And now to add loss and damage to that, and loss and damage is the irreparable damage that's done, but we can no longer pay back. That's a huge pillar of climate debt as well. I want to speak to a very important legal principle that's present in the UN Climate Convention. And because the UNFCCC is fundamentally a burden-sharing agreement, it's this incredible puzzle, very difficult puzzle, of how to equitably share the burden of addressing the climate crisis between 198 countries. And So you need principles in order to share that burden fairly. And one of the principles that is core to the convention is this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And it's essentially, I'll just read the definition. The global nature of climate change calls for the widest possible cooperation by all countries in their participation in an effective and appropriate international response in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities and their social and economic conditions. Which essentially means that every country must contribute, no matter how small, but their contribution has to be according to their respective capability, and those responsibilities are going to be of different sizes. And I want to lift up this principle CBDR because it's one that's been very much under attack, even though it's core to the convention. I've been tracking the UNFCCC negotiations for about 10 years, actually about 15 years now, since 2009. And we've seen in every single COP, we've seen a slow eroding and undermining of this particular principle, because the same powers that are holding so much of the unjust and unsustainable debt also want to take away their responsibility to contribute. There are other principles that underpin the convention, like historical responsibility, polluter pays, and the right to develop. So those are sort of the equity principles that, if we followed them, would lead to an effective burden sharing of the climate crisis. I will go a little faster here.
Yeah, if you could actually just wrap up because we are past time.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Yeah, let's get past this. I just want to quickly lift up this project that we're working on called the Fair Shares, Canada's Fair Share. And it's a group of, it's a national coalition across Canada that has built a set of demands and a platform for Canada to do its fair share internationally, which is connecting climate justice to debt cancellation and to tax reform and trade reform and climate finance. And so I'll drop that link in the chat as well. And thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you so much, Anjali. I regret having to cut that short because the information is so important. But I think it's really critical the way that you took us back to that fundamental question of who owes whom. And in doing so, you made those important links between debt cancellation and climate justice. So, for Canada and other wealthy industrialized countries, we can make choices that have a big impact if we see the cancellation of unsustainable debts as a way of freeing up money. So countries in the global south who are badly impacted by climate change can invest in climate adaptation and mitigation. So much appreciated. And we'll move on now to our next speaker, who's Dr. Grieve Chawwa. Grieve is currently Associate Professor of Political Economy and Chair of the Social Sciences Department at the Africa Institute. In February of this year, Dr. Chawwa was appointed by Pope Francis to the Jubilee Commission. The Jubilee Commission on Debt and Development Crisis in the Global South. His latest edited book is titled, Can Africans Do Economics? And it argues for a new type of emancipatory policymaking in Africa. Sounds great. Grieve, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Sue. Greetings from Lusaka, Zambia, which is considered by many as ground zero for the debt crisis in the global south. As I was speaking to you, Sue, and a couple other colleagues before we started this online event, we are struggling with crippling blackouts here. We have 5 hours of electricity a day, and this is not an accident, but it's the result of 30 or 40 years of austerity, IMF-imposed austerity, which I'll speak about in a short while. So, this stuff really, really matters. Imagine what it's like to try to develop when you have 5 hours of electricity supply a day. I also want to acknowledge Professor Martin Guzman, who just spoke before me. He's a commissioner alongside me on the Jubilee Commission that was convened by the late Pope Francis. May he so rest in peace. And Martin played a really, really crucial role in really shepherding the 30 of us who were working with him on this report and really did much of the grunt work. And I really admire his energy and enthusiasm. I want to use my brief remarks to talk about Zambia's debt dynamics, right? To understand the origin and the crisis of Zambia's debt crisis. How is it that Zambia became ground zero of the current crisis in the global south? And I want to place this Zambia's story in its proper historical context. Often when we talk about issues of debt, we forget the role of history. Doing so will make it clear that Zambia is not unique in this regard. Second, I'd like to talk about Zambia's frustrations with attempts at debt resolution, attempts that are still ongoing 5 years after the country defaulted on its debt in 2020. So how are we to understand Zambia's debt dynamics? Zambia's debt story did not begin today, but can be traced back to historical forces that were set in motion many decades ago, and in some cases, a century ago. This is crucially important to understand, given the temptation to see the current crisis as solely a creation of bad governance or fiscal financial mismanagement. This viewpoint, seeing the crisis as one of bad governance and fiscal mismanagement, is alive and strong today. And that is why in the current framework, a necessary and sufficient condition for debt resolution is to impose austerity, that is financial discipline, on the errant country, Zambia. So let me quickly discuss some of the historical forces that explain the current debt story that Zambia finds itself in today. A first historical force is the role of copper, that red metal that is so vital for electric conduction and power, and is currently powering the green transition today. Much of this green transition is happening in the north, not in the south, and yet it is powered by resources in the south, which is a point that has been made already about ecological debt. Copper is incredibly important to Zambia, earning it somewhere between in the order of 70% of the country's foreign exchange earnings. Zambia's integration into the world capitalist system was formally facilitated with the establishment of the first commercial copper mine by the British colonialists in 1928. Copper was then to become the driving force of external debt dynamics in the country, whose fortune on the world commodity markets would determine whether we build up debt and whether we end up with a debt crisis. For example, Zambia's first debt crisis, which originated in the late 70s, was resolved when the country reached the hippie completion point in 2003. Right, and that crisis itself was largely the story of copper price dynamics. In the independence decade of the 1960s, the price of copper increased by 70%. In the 3 decades after this, the price of copper declined, continued on a 30-year decline. This then sent the country into a balance of payments tailspin that resulted in the Zambia's first debt crisis, and also these particular dynamics also explain the current debt crisis. So the first historical force is copper, which drives debt in Zambia. The second historical process that explains our current debt conjuncture and related to the first one is the structural adjustment process, whose implementation in Africa began in the 80s, and in Zambia in particular was implemented in the 90s under the aegis of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Prior to the structural adjustment process, many poor countries such as Zambia were encouraged to invest in large-scale long-term infrastructure, and such infrastructure projects were funded and encouraged by the likes of the World Bank. The classic example is the giant Kariba Dam, which is one of the biggest hydroelectric dams in the world, which was completed in 1959, and for a long time powered Zambia's electricity until it wasn't sufficient. And so Zambia went on an infrastructure drive right after independence, with much of the country's infrastructure that is relied on today built in these first 2 decades after independence. But with structural adjustment, which also meant an ideological shift in the way international financial institutions saw the world, funding for large-scale long-term infrastructure projects declined, alongside forcing governments to run so-called cash budgets, which essentially was an austerity measure. So this meant that for a 20-year period from about 1990 up until 2010, many countries in Africa and much of the global south were not adding to the stock of infrastructure, even as population growth increased, which is a crisis we find ourselves today, having only 5 hours of power a day. So by the time 2010 arrived, the infrastructure gap was large and palpable. And this is not just a Zambian story. One just has to drive around a major African city today to see the endless traffic jams to get a feel of this problem, and essentially the endless power outages that we see across Africa. The Africa Development Bank estimates that our countries need collectively to spend about $100 billion per annum to plug this infrastructure gap, which has its origins in the structure adjustment era. Right, so this is the second historical force, and I will bring them together. So you've got the copper story, you've got the structural adjustment story, and then let me talk about the third historical force. The third historical force is the role of United States and in general Western country monetary policy and how the effects of this policy reverberate across the world and especially in Africa. The first debt crisis was triggered in Africa was triggered by the so-called Volcker shock. Paul Volcker was chairperson of the Federal Reserve in the United States during the Reagan administration. He began to drastically increase interest rates in the US to fight inflation in the late 70s, early 80s. This had the immediate result that all our debt, which was mostly dollar denominated, became more expensive to service, hence triggering the crisis. The current buildup is also the result of massive liquidity post the Great Recession. As the US and the West were trying to get out of the Great Recession, they embarked on a lengthy program of monetary easing. Interest rates were close to zero in many Western countries. Much of this liquidity found its way to the global South as debt. And then the current debt crisis has also been triggered by the opposite policy of monetary tightening in the US, the raising of interest rates to fight inflation, right? So in the case of Zambia, the conjuncture of these three historical processes, copper, structural adjustment, and US Western monetary policy came together in about 2011, 2012. A new government had just been elected on a platform of resolving the infrastructure backlog that I talked about earlier. On the other hand, the focus for copper prices for the decade 2010 to 2019 was very rosy. And in fact, the IMF was saying things are always going to be good for you, Zambia, so why don't you consider taking out debt? And then developed country and especially US interest rates were at record lows. So we then issued in Zambia, three Euro bonds totaling $3 billion in quick succession between 2012 and 2015, increasing our external debt stock by 300% in just 3 years. Now, when the Eurobond money began to flow, so did Chinese money. After all, the Chinese could see that so-called sophisticated Western banks and sophisticated hedge funds were lapping up Zambian debt in the billions. So they too lent to Zambia. So that by 2019, Zambia's external debt had grown by over 1,000% in just 8 years. So Zambia was left with no choice with this kind of trajectory but to default in November 2020 when COVID arrived. So just to sort of wrap up, what are the lessons that one draws from the Zambian story? The current debt crisis is largely a result of long-term historical processes, as I've illustrated, that cannot be simply reduced to financial mismanagement. There's a very big temptation, one sees it everywhere, to blame the victim, really. And I think in the Zambian case, as I've illustrated, much of the action is on the external side. It's mostly historical forces beyond the country's control, although one should not paper over financial mismanagement, certainly. If we only focus on financial mismanagement, this crisis will happen over and over again. So if we think we can fix debt permanently by fiscal austerity, then we are kidding ourselves. 2050 will come and we'll again have a Jubilee Commission, right? Preventing future sovereign debt crisis will require that we fix these historical structural processes as outlined above and as outlined in the Jubilee Commission report and as eloquently delivered by Professor Guzman a short while ago. So how do we, for example, we need to think about how do we better insulate poor countries from commodity price shocks? Do we encourage them to develop sovereign wealth funds? Do we encourage them to diversify away from exporting raw copper, for example, onto manufacturers? And what is the role of multilateral development banks in this process? What is the role of the global north? To the extent that they acknowledge the historical debt, I think folks have been talking about the historical debt here. To the extent that there's a historical moral debt, how can countries in the global north help countries in the south to diversify towards producing manufacturers? How do we solve the infrastructure problem with appropriate debt instruments? Do we need to think about new types of global south-centric development banks, local development banks? Some of these things are really in the Jubilee report, where we are trying to propose new types of local regional development banks, lending, borrowing in local currency, and so on and so forth. So how do we solve the permanent infrastructure problem? If Zambia is going to be producing 5 hours of electricity per day, forget about development. You're really consigning millions of people to permanent poverty. How do we insulate our countries from Western country monetary policy? Do we think about new bilateral or currency arrangements that bypass the dollar? There's a big discussion about the dollarization today. This discussion is real, precisely because if you are linked to the dollar, you're susceptible to, if what's the expression, if the US coughs, the rest of us catch a cold. So how do we then bypass some of these this over reliance on the dollar? Is the IMF really an effective lender of last resort in today's world? Right? Can the IMF really? Is it possible to reform the IMF to intervene in a timely, quick manner without relying on austerity? So there is some discussion about that in the Jubilee Commission report. Some final thoughts as I wrap up in 2 minutes. Some final thoughts on the current inadequate attempts at resolving Zambia's debt crisis. Zambia defaulted on its debt in November 2020. In April 2021, the country applied for debt treatment under the G20's common framework. Professor Guzman talked about that. A new approach to resolving poor countries' debt, and Zambia was the first test case, so the guinea pig really of this experiment. How is it going? This July will make it 4 years since we applied for debt treatment under the common G20 common framework, but our debt is yet to be conclusively and permanently resolved. And here we're talking about some $16 to $17 billion of debt, which is pocket change if you think about the value of global debt markets. In the interim, given all this uncertainty and the lack of resolution, the Zambian kwacha, the currency, the Zambia kar, has been incredibly unstable and depreciated by as much as 100% in this period, sending the price of goods and services to skyrocket, given that we're an import-dependent country. So imagine what this means for the welfare of the poor, the marginalized, and so on and so forth. Simultaneously, the common framework requires that the errant country, Zambia, gets on an IMF program, which we have done, the 13th one since 1980. And as we all know, getting on an IMF program requires austerity, given that the presumption of financial mismanagement plays a very big role in the imagination of the international financial institutions.
Okay, that's great. So if we can finish up there.
Okay, the last point,
Okay.
and then I wrap up. Also, it is worth noting that the current proposals for resolving Zambia's debt crisis, this sort of the ones that are on the table, are a sort of heads I win, tails you lose type of scenario. Creditors have agreed in principle to give the country a longer grace period to pay off their debt, but this grace period will be drastically shortened should the country's economy improve. An absurd premise on which to predicate a debt resolution. So really, essentially, what's on the table now to resolve Zambia's debt is not going to resolve this debt permanently. This is why I'm very much encouraged by the proposals contained in our new report, the Jubilee Commission report. Had these proposals been around and implemented before Zambia's crisis, I think would have gone a long way to make things better. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for this opportunity, and I look forward to the Q&A that's going to follow.
And thank you so much. I really appreciated you giving us the historical context for Zambia's debt. I think that context is especially helpful for encouraging us to question those assumptions about financial mismanagement when we look at the situation of debt-distressed countries. Also found it very useful, the review of the harmful role that austerity has played. So clearly debt is never one thing, and your input has encouraged us to ask more questions, which is a perfect segue into our question period. We don't have a lot of time, but I've been asking Sarah to gather questions. So Sarah, if you could maybe pick a few of those questions or gather some together, perhaps.
Sure. Thanks, Sue. I wonder if we might start. I know Martin has been addressing a question from Joe Gunn in the chat. I wonder if you might speak to it, Martin. So the question from Joe, and maybe Grieve, you want to jump in too. The question was, why did the Jubilee report avoid any mention of canceling debts? So why didn't reforms you mentioned go deeper than the call for HIPC 2 when we know that the first HIPC didn't work? Bring the necessary reform. And I know, Martin, you put a number of recommendations in the chat, but maybe you can speak to a few of them. And I don't know, Grieve, if you have anything to add to the conversation too.
Sure, I'm happy to do so. I was just replying in the chat that first I was thankful for the question, but making the point that the reading of the report is incorrect. Actually, the first step towards the resolution of the crisis is debt restructuring in the countries that have debt distress. And that means a reduction in the value of the debts for many of the countries, together with a sufficiently long extension of maturities, we don't think the financial conditions are going to get any better in the near term for the developing world. Actually, even the IMF has downgraded the growth prospects for the developing world in the current global situation. So it's going to take time. These countries were not ready to access international private credit markets. They did it at high rates, short maturities. That's not financing for development. When you finance a project for, say, education, it may take 20 years or more until you reap the returns from those investments for economic development. So that was the wrong kind of finance. Some cases have too much debt. Other countries have the wrong kind of debt. All of them need debt operations. In some cases, there is need for reductions in face value, extension of maturities, and interest rate reductions. In others, a reduction of interest rates and extension of maturities, as long as they are sufficiently long, will suffice. Then, with respect to HIPIC, we speak of a new HIPIC, but carefully, because this is a different word than 25 years ago, the previous Jubilee. The big problem, as I explained in my remarks, is with the private sector. It's not just government to government debt. It's contracts. So when we speak of contracts, the word we use is restructuring. Restructuring because you need to rewrite the contract. But the restructurings have to happen. Otherwise, countries won't be able to come out of the situation in which they are. Let me stop here, Sarah.
Okay, thanks. And Grieve, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think Martin
Okay,
adequately.
that covered it. Okay, anybody else for that question? Or will we move on to the next question, Sarah?
Sure, we have a question around, if this is the Canadian context, so maybe this is a question for Angela, or maybe Sue, you want to jump in as well. But around the question of debt relief, if it's on the radar of our new government in Canada, given that the G7 was held just last month in Canada.
Okay, Angeli?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The
I
question's,
just heard the second part.
so just is debt relief on the radar of the new government of Canada?
Oh, in a short answer, I don't think so. And so we're working to put it on their radar. So if there's anyone in Canada here on the call and wants to help us with that, we are starting to have meetings with MPs. A couple of MPs are aware of it. We know that Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, understands climate finance and understands debt, because we know he's been in some of those rooms and he's listened to Global South leaders like Mia Motley speak about this. I don't think it's high on their priority list right now because everybody's very tense with Canada-US relations, but we will be taking this Fair Shares platform that we have developed to MPs across the country. And if anybody's interested in meeting with their MP, please do get in touch.
That's great, thanks. And some more information going in the chat on that as well. Sarah, do you have any more questions there?
There's a question. So Janet raised the issue of the UN Framework Convention on Debt Resolution, and moving it through the UN General Assembly. I wonder if there's any ideas for how that might happen from this. The panel have ideas for moving it through the General Assembly.
Okay, any one of our speakers, Grieve, did you want to jump in there?
And I'll probably defer to Martin. I'm not an expert in the intricacies of the UN, and how to move with it. How to move stuff and make them politically palatable there. Maybe Martin has some ideas. I don't know.
I'm not an expert on the intricacies of the UN, but I'm happy to respond to one of the questions that was put on the chat by Anita Thomas. Should I?
Sure, yes.
Sure.
Should I read the question first for everyone? Okay, so the question is, the question says that in many countries from the Southern Hemisphere, the Global South, private creditors such as hedge funds, asset managers, and commercial banks hold a significant portion of sovereign debts, which is, of course, correct. And unlike multilateral institutions, these private creditors aren't bound by coordinated restructuring rules, which can lead to delays, litigation, and higher costs for debtor nations. Like, that's also true. There is no international mechanism for restructuring unsustainable debts, which is part of the problem. It's one of the missing pieces of the architecture. And actually, the Jubilee report calls for the creation of an international mechanism for the restructuring of unsustainable debts. Because otherwise, what happens is that every time there is a situation of debt distress, there has to be a decentralized negotiation between a debtor and many different creditors with no other principles than power. Power rules. There are very pervasive asymmetries also between a debtor and the creditors, among the creditors, and among different debtors. Different creditors have different capabilities. And the outcomes are often bad. The typical outcome in sovereign debt restructuring is too little and too late, meaning that countries delay too much the initiation of a restructuring, and when it happens, it's generally insufficient to restore the sustainability of the debt. So the system doesn't work. Not only it doesn't work at the moment of the restructuring, but also it leads to too much of the wrong kind of debt in the first place. And the system is pro-cyclical for the developing world. When there is abundance of money in the global economy, in the good times, capital flows to the developing world. But when there is uncertainty, capital goes back to the safety of the advanced economies. So for advanced economies, the system is counter-cyclical. It's good for them. But for the developing world, it's pro-cyclical. It creates more instability. So again, going back to the initial question of who are the winners and who are the losers that Sue Wilson posed, the advanced countries benefit from this system. They have a counter-cyclical tool. The developing nations are the ones that suffer the counter-cyclicality. So then the question asks, what reforms do you see as essential to address both the influence of private creditors and corruption in sovereign debt crisis? Transparency will help a lot on both sides. Most times, the debtors don't know who holds the bonds. There is an enormous lack of transparency. The debtor only knows who holds the bonds when it starts a negotiation and there is a non-disclosure agreement with those that end up sitting. Those that don't sit at the negotiating table, they may not disclose the bonds that they hold. So the debtor may not know what the incentives of the creditors are. And on the other hand, debtors would do much better by having legislation that implies more transparency. There should be public registries of all the debts, and there should be more accountability, more presence, more presence, more influence of Congress in the borrowing policies. Because the borrowing policies of governments affect multiple generations. So it's important that parliaments, the Congress, also has a say in the borrowing policies of a debtor nation. So there is a lot that can be improved, and the Jubilee report lays out a blueprint for reforms that could improve the system.
Thank you. That's great, a very comprehensive response to that. I'm wanting to go back to the question about UN structures. Anita, I'm wondering if you're the best person to answer that. Sarah, if you could repeat the question. Anita, see if that's something that you would want to dive in on.
So the question is around the UN Framework Convention on debt, on sovereign debt. And given that it was sort of shut out of the FFD conversations recently, but it's better placed through the UN General Assembly, and how might that be moved into that space, that conversation?
So when we were following the negotiations in the lead up to the financing for development outcome document, you could, if you follow that process, you can really see the country positions. And my recommendation is that we take a look at how countries are leading on these various initiatives and use that process, because the tax convention process has been a highly successful initiative, collaboration between civil society organization. And really coming out of such a conversation as today, my suggestion would be to use a similar approach as we approach the General Assembly discussions, and take a look at how countries are positioning themselves. The NGO Committee on FFD itself, we conduct several mission visits throughout the year. And for us to engage with member states on a one-to-one basis, really to clarify some of the concerns, why they voted in a particular manner, and how can we bring those conversations. And it's for us as civil society organizations, come to that table and to have that conversation one-on-one with them. I don't think there is any other way to engage other than to meet with them directly, and to understand why they are positioning. Even I think it was Anjali earlier was talking about the differentiated responsibilities. That was a huge conflicting issue during the negotiations, right? And when we look at why countries are positioning themselves in a certain way, it's important for us to really delve deeper and understand, and to be coming with that informed knowledge rather than saying the country is taking this position, so we are against it. But we come with that informed understanding of what is actually happening on the ground and why is it that we are making these recommendations, and see, how we can follow a similar path as the tax convention process has been happening at the UN. And so I don't know if that has sort of helped you with the responses.
Okay, Anita, thank you very much. We are getting very close to our end time. I don't know if there's a quick question there, Sarah, or if we should.
Let's say one more question. We have a question for Grieve, actually. So it's from Anita, who's on screen. So it's about dollarization. So could you comment on the role of central bank digital currencies, especially considering Zambia is exploring this? What role it might play in reinforcing or challenging the global dominance of the US dollar? Do CBDCs offer a real path toward de-dollarization?
Thanks for that question, Sarah. So, I mean, the general point to understand here is that it's an aspect of failed genuine multilateralism, right? So the point is, I think, as a world, we might need a global reserve currency, a currency that allows us to conduct trade, to exchange goods and services with one another. Now, that currency should not be susceptible to the exercise of imperial power, which is essentially what happens with the dollar. And I think in 1944, at a Bretton Woods conference, I think John Maynard Keynes proposed what he called a bancor, where he proposed an idea of a global currency that wasn't susceptible to this kind of power misuse by one particular country or group of countries. Now, central bank digital currencies, I don't think would resolve this problem, because essentially what it is the Zambian kwacha would just have a digital form of the Zambian kwacha. But what we desperately need in Zambia is we want to buy stuff from Argentina. We want to buy beef from Martin's Argentina. But to do that, we probably have to go through the US dollar, right? We need to accumulate dollars to do these kind of transactions. And the US dollar can be used to sanction you, or the US dollar, the folks in the US may decide to change their monetary policy one way or the other. So what we genuinely need to push for is arrangements that allow us to exchange goods with one another. And those arrangements should really be genuinely multilateral, where each one of us, each country in the world, has a stake in how that currency is, currency is issued, how it is controlled, and so on and so forth. So this would be my response. I don't think central bank digital currencies are the answer to this problem of de-dollarization. And the problem of de-dollarization is not just we are saying no to the dollar. We're trying to fix a genuine problem of trying to exchange with one another across the world, and to do so in ways that does not allow us to be susceptible to US monetary policy or to be sanctioned. You could be sanctioned easily, and all of a sudden you're shut out of the international payment system, and then your people suffer here and there. So I hope I answered this question correctly. So digital currencies aren't the solution, but genuine multilateralism towards a truly global reserve currency that's controlled by all of us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's super helpful. And I want to thank all our panelists for what I have found to be a very informative and interesting and even challenging discussion. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Janet for our closing, please.
Thank you so much, Sue. And thank you again to all of you for joining us today for our 2025 High-Level Political Forum side event, Beyond Default, the Liberating Power of Debt Reform. As Sue indicated, I would like to thank Sue, our moderator, and speakers for your generosity with your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise and commitment to debt reform, ecological justice, and sustainable development that benefits all, leaving no one behind by prioritizing those who are currently most behind. I would also like to thank the many partner organizations who made this event possible. The Congregation of St. Joseph NGO to the United Nations, the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary Loreto Generale, Caritas Internationalis, the NGO Committee on Financing for Development, as well as the numerous Canadian partners, the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology, Development and Peace, Caritas Canada, CSJ Federation Office for Systemic Justice, Center Oblat, the Martha Justice Ministry, and the Mary Ward Center. Thank you also to Anna for translating for us today. We heard that the SDGs will not be achieved without all of us working together. So today, I would like to encourage you all to take part in the 2025 Jubilee campaign, Turn Debt into Hope. We remember that the 2000 Jubilee campaign rallied millions of people and resulted in transformative action for debt reform, including the cancellation of 100 billion of debt for 36 low-income countries. Let's make this happen again this year. We know it can be done. Sign the Jubilee petition and call on your governments, especially those of us coming from the global north, to cancel and remedy unjust and unsustainable debt, support the reform of the international financial architecture, and establish a United Nations Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. For the sake of the most vulnerable in our world and all of us, let us take bold action to uphold dignity, equity, and sustainable development for all. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good day, and let's make this happen.